Hi, I'm Alex, and I watched our best aviation engineer, a chief warrant officer, with a chest full of ribbons, laugh in the face of a 12-year-old refugee girl. She was trying to point out what was wrong with the dead engine of our only rescue helicopter. Little did he know, the lives of an entire Special Forces team depended on that little girl. Have you ever felt completely invisible, even when you knew you held the answer that could save everyone? Before I tell you how she used a simple piece of scrap metal to rewire that vintage Soviet engine and bring it screaming back to life, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Believe me, you won't want to miss the look on that engineer's face when the rotors finally started to turn. The tension on our forward operating base was so thick you could taste it in the air, a bitter mix of sand and fear. A monster of a sandstorm was boiling up on the horizon, threatening to shut down the entire valley. High on a ridge miles away, a recon team was pinned down, their comms crackling with the sound of incoming fire and their voices getting tighter as they reported ammo running low. Their only ticket out was an old Mi-17, a relic from another era, but the only bird we had that could handle a high-altitude landing in the dust. And it was dead. The engine wouldn't make a sound. Panic was starting to set in, a quiet, creeping dread that infected every one of us. And then there was Amara. She was a ghost who haunted the edges of our base, a kid from the refugee camp just outside the wire. To most of us, she was just part of the landscape, another face in the crowd of locals we were told to keep our distance from. She was quiet, with eyes that seemed to see everything but say nothing. I'd see her watching the mechanics, her small form half hidden behind a stack of sandbags or a parked vehicle. We saw a child, a girl, a refugee, a triple threat of irrelevance in our world. We were trained to see threats and objectives, not the quiet, resilient strength of a kid who had already lost everything. She was utterly invisible. The men who were supposed to be in charge were falling apart. Chief Warrant Officer Evans, our lead aviation engineer, was the kind of guy who believed if a problem couldn't be solved with a diagnostic laptop, it wasn't a real problem. He was practically kicking the helicopter's landing gear, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. His modern tech was useless against this old Soviet machine. Then there was Sergeant Miller, a good NCO but worn down to a raw nerve. His job was perimeter security, and to him, Amara was just one more thing to worry about, one more potential problem to be yelled at and chased away. Their authority was absolute, but it was failing them, and they hated it. For hours they had swarmed the Mi-17 like angry ants. I watched from my post as Evans and his team ran every diagnostic in the book. Laptops were plugged in, schematics were unrolled across the dusty hood of a Humvee, and the air was filled with technical jargon and frustrated curses. They checked every circuit, every fuse, every system that their manuals told them to check. The whole scene was a monument to failure. A perfect picture of high-tech confidence smashing into a wall of old-world, analog reality. The silence from the engine was deafening, a constant reminder that the men on that ridge were running out of time, and our best and brightest had no answers left to give. That's when I saw her move. The wind was picking up, whipping sand into everyone's eyes, and in the confusion, Amara slipped past a distracted guard. She didn't approach the soldiers. She went straight for the helicopter, her small hand resting on the engine casing as if she were listening for a heartbeat. Then she pointed, her finger jabbing insistently at a grimy panel near the exhaust, and she spoke a single word in her native tongue, a word that sounded like spark. Sergeant Miller saw her instantly. He moved to grab her, his voice a harsh bark. "Hey, get away from there! Get back to the camp!" It was an immediate, brutal dismissal, the kind of casual cruelty born from stress and prejudice. Her knowledge was rejected before it was even heard. But Amara didn't flinch or cry. She just stood there, a small, unmovable object in the path of a storm of military authority. She held Sergeant Miller's gaze for a second, then looked past him to Chief Evans, who was now walking over with a smirk on his face. "What's going on here, Sergeant?" Evans asked, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. "Are we so desperate we're taking mechanical advice from the local children now?" He let out a short, sharp laugh, and a few of the other mechanics chuckled along with him. The sound was ugly. It wasn't just a dismissal. It was a public humiliation, designed to put her, and anyone who might consider her, back in their place. I felt a hot knot of anger tighten in my stomach, watching them mock the one person who wasn't panicking. Just as Miller was about to physically escort her away, a burst of static-filled screaming erupted from the radio operator's headset nearby. The voice was thin and desperate. "Talisman 1, we are taking heavy contact from the east. We can't hold this position much longer. Where is our bird?" The raw panic in that transmission sliced through the air, silencing the laughter. Captain Hayes, the pilot, a young officer who looked like he hadn't slept in a week, slammed his fist on the fuselage. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a fear that overrode all protocol. He turned on Miller and Evans, his voice cracking with desperation. "Let her! For God's sake, what do we have to lose? Let the kid look! Now!" It wasn't a request. It was the plea of a drowning man reaching for anything that floated. Chief Evans looked like he'd been slapped. His face went from smug to thunderous in a heartbeat. To be overruled by a younger, less technically minded officer in front of his own team was the ultimate insult. "Captain, with all due respect, this is a multi-million-dollar piece of equipment," he hissed, his professionalism a thin veil over his wounded pride. "We are not letting a refugee child play mechanic with the lives of our men on the line." But Hayes just stared him down, his expression a mask of grim finality. "Their lives are already on the line, Chief, and your equipment is a useless hunk of metal right now. She looks. That's an order." Miller froze, caught between two warring authorities, his hand still hovering near Amara's shoulder. The other soldiers just looked down, shuffling their feet, wanting to be anywhere else. Amara seemed oblivious to the power struggle she had just ignited. As soon as Hayes gave his desperate command, she simply turned and walked back to the open engine compartment, her movements calm and deliberate. She didn't wait for a second invitation. It was as if the angry words of the men were just noise, like the wind. She hoisted herself up, her small frame disappearing halfway into the helicopter's guts. There was no hesitation. She didn't look around for tools or ask for a flashlight. She just reached in, her hands moving with a familiarity that was jarring to watch. I remember thinking about my own grandfather, who could diagnose a car engine just by the feel of its vibrations. She was doing the same, but with a machine of war, surrounded by men who had forgotten how to listen. I moved closer, trying to see what she was doing. Her small hands, covered in a thin layer of dust and grease, bypassed the main terminal blocks and shiny new components the American mechanics had been obsessing over. Instead, she traced a thick, braided bundle of old wires, her fingers dancing over them with a light touch. She wasn't testing for continuity with a meter. She was feeling for something else, something her father must have taught her. I could almost hear a phantom voice in my head, a memory of a story from an old village elder. "The old Soviet machines have a soul. They get tired. You can't fix them by yelling at them with new tools. You have to find where they are hurting." It was exactly what she was doing, searching for the source of the pain. Then she stopped. Her finger rested on one specific wire almost completely hidden beneath a larger hose. It had a faint, darkish discoloration, a slight charring that was nearly invisible against the grimy background of the engine block. It looked like nothing. A spot of burnt oil, maybe. I'd seen Evans and his team wipe that exact area clean an hour earlier, dismissing it as just part of the mess. Amara pointed to it, then looked back at Captain Hayes, who was now peering over her shoulder. Chief Evans pushed his way forward, squinting. He saw the spot she was indicating, and let out a snort of derision. That's just a heat stain, kid. It means nothing." He was so sure, so arrogant, so utterly and completely wrong. That was the moment I almost broke. I wanted to grab Evans by his collar and scream in his face. All his training, his rank, his confidence, it was all just a wall of pride standing between that recon team and their lives. But I was just a specialist. My voice meant less than nothing. I just stood there, my fists clenched, feeling useless. Amara didn't even look at Evans. She ignored his comment completely, her focus absolute. With a determination that was almost frightening in a child, she followed that discolored wire with her finger, tracing its path deep into a tangled mess of analog machinery. She wasn't asking for permission anymore. She was showing them the answer, and a tense silence fell over the flight line as every single soldier, from the lowest private to the chief warrant officer, watched her small hand disappear into the heart of the dead machine. Her hand reemerged from the engine's guts a moment later, clutching a small, grimy metal box, no bigger than a deck of cards. It was caked in years of filth and had a faint Cyrillic lettering stamped on its lid, almost completely worn away. She held it out. Chief Evans stepped forward, peering at it with a look of pure disgust. "That's an old T7 voltage regulator. It's an antique," he declared to the small crowd of onlookers, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "It's not even on our schematics anymore. It was hard bypassed during the last systems upgrade. It's a dead component, a relic." He waved his hand dismissively, as if swatting away a fly, turning his back on her to look at his diagnostic screen again, completely writing her off. Amara paid him no mind. Her entire world had shrunk to the small, stubborn box in her hands. She tried to pry the lid open with her fingernails. Her small face nodded in concentration. The metal was sealed shut with a thick crust of rust and corrosion. She grunted with effort, her knuckles white, but it wouldn't budge. Just then, the radio crackled to life again, the voice from the ridge thin and ragged with static and sheer terror. "Talisman, we're taking casualties. I say again, we have men down. Where are you? Where is our exit?" The words hung in the air, a death sentence delivered over the radio. The wind seemed to howl in response, and I felt a cold dread wash over me. The time for theories and diagnostics was over. That was when Captain Hayes broke. He ripped the multi-tool from the pouch on his belt, the click of the plastic buckle echoing in the tense silence. He didn't say a word to Evans. He didn't look at anyone else. He stepped right up to Amara, knelt down so he was at her eye level, and held out the tool. It was a simple, profound gesture. An officer, a pilot, placing his trust, and the lives of his men, not in his multi-million-dollar training or his expert engineer, but in the hands of a refugee girl holding a piece of junk. Evans saw it, and his jaw tightened, his face turning a dark shade of red. He had been publicly undermined by an act of pure, unadulterated desperation. Amara looked at the complex, folded-up tool for a second, then took it from the pilot's outstretched hand. She ignored the pliers, the knife, and the various screwdriver heads. She unfolded a single, simple component, the small, coarse metal file. With a steadiness that defied the chaos around her, she began to scrape at the seam of the rusted box. The sound was agonizingly slow and loud in the quiet tension, a high-pitched asterisk scree asterisk of metal against corrosion. It was the only sound besides the wind and the distant, muffled pop of gunfire from the radio. Each grating stroke felt like it was scraping away at the last seconds of those men's lives on the mountain. It was a painstaking, delicate, and maddeningly slow process. Evans couldn't take the sight of it anymore. He spun around, his face a mask of fury and wounded pride. "Captain, I am formally protesting this course of action. This is a complete and utter waste of our last remaining minutes. That regulator is an analog fossil. The system's power runs through a digital converter now. She is literally scratching a piece of garbage while our men are dying up there." His voice was shaking with rage, but there was something else in it too. Fear. The fear of being wrong. The terror of his entire world of rules, manuals, and schematics being proven worthless by a child with a piece of metal. But Hayes didn't even look at him. His eyes were fixed on Amara's hands. With a final, forceful scrape, the lid of the little box popped loose. Amara pried it open and showed the contents to Hayes. Inside, it was a simple, primitive mechanism. 2 thick copper contact points, separated by a tiny gap, both covered in a crust of chalky green corrosion. It was the heart of the problem, a mechanical failure so old and basic that no diagnostic laptop would ever find it. She looked up from the box, and her eyes found mine across the tarmac. She held up her 2 small index fingers, keeping them apart, then brought them together in a clear, simple gesture. A bridge. She was showing us, not telling us. The connection was broken. It needed to be reestablished. Before anyone could process what she was showing them, she dropped the expensive multi-tool to the ground with a loud clatter. She wasn't looking for a sophisticated solution. Her eyes darted around the dusty ground, scanning the debris near a stack of sandbags. She ignored the mechanic's toolkits, the spare parts, everything. Then she saw it. A small, discarded piece of scrap wire, the kind used to tie down tarps, lying in the dirt. It was thin, rusty, and coated in sand. She snatched it up and turned back to the engine. Evans let out a choked, incredulous laugh. "A piece of baling wire? Is this a joke?" he sputtered, his voice cracking. "She's going to hot wire a Soviet turbine with a piece of trash?" The contempt in his voice was absolute. the final, arrogant judgment before everything changed. She ignored the chief's bitter laugh completely, as if he were nothing more than a buzzing fly. Her entire universe had shrunk down to the piece of scrap wire in her hand. Using the metal file from the pilot's tool, she began to patiently scrape the rust off a small section of it. The sound was grating, a rhythmic shink, shink, shink that seemed to count down the final seconds for the men on that ridge. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, her small tongue sticking out of the corner of her mouth. Every single person on that flight line, from the lowest private to the most seasoned NCO, was frozen, watching this little girl meticulously preparing a piece of trash as if she were a surgeon sterilizing a scalpel. It was the most surreal, most tense moment of my entire deployment. Chief Evans finally snapped. He couldn't bear the sight of his authority being so thoroughly dismantled by a child with a piece of wire. He stomped over to Captain Hayes, his face purple with rage. "Captain, I am ordering you to stop this. This is a flagrant violation of every maintenance protocol we have. You are letting an untrained civilian jam an ungrounded, conductive foreign object into a high-voltage ignition system. She could short out the entire electrical bus, fry the avionics, and turn this helicopter into a permanent paperweight. We might still be able to fix this the right way, but if she does what I think she's about to do, you'll be personally responsible for grounding our only heavy-lift asset and sentencing those men to death." Captain Hayes didn't even turn to look at him. His eyes were locked on Amara's small, steady hands. His voice, when he finally spoke, was dangerously calm, a low rumble that cut through the wind. "Their death sentence was signed the moment your diagnostics failed, Chief. This helicopter is already a paperweight. It is a very expensive, very sophisticated coffin that is doing absolutely nothing to save my men. She has an idea. It might be a crazy one, it might be a stupid one, but it's more than any of us have come up with in the last 4 hours. So you are going to stand down, and you are going to let her finish. That's my final word on it." The challenge was so direct, so final, that Evans just stood there, speechless, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. Amara finished her work. The small section of wire now glinted with a dull silver shine. She looked up, not at the fuming chief engineer, but directly at Captain Hayes. She gave him a single, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a gesture of hope. It was a command. "Get ready." Hayes understood instantly. He turned without another word and scrambled up into the cockpit, his boots clanging on the metal steps. The rest of us instinctively took a step back, creating a wide, silent circle around the engine. The only sounds were the howling wind and the frantic, muffled clicks of switches from inside the cockpit as Hayes ran through the pre-flight checklist one last, desperate time. The air was electric with a terrifying, unspoken question. What if this actually works? Leaning back into the guts of the machine, Amara didn't just shove the wire in. I watched her carefully bend it with her small fingers, forming it into a precise U shape. It was a deliberate, practiced movement, one that spoke of muscle memory, not guesswork. She was crafting a tool, not just using a piece of junk. She held it up to the light for a moment, checking the angle, before reaching deep inside the engine bay again. She wasn't aiming for the main power block, or any of the complex components Evans had been focused on. She was aiming for that one, tiny, forgotten regulator box. She was about to perform a kind of mechanical surgery that no manual in the world would ever describe, a fix born from a forgotten generation of engineering. Just as her hand steadied, ready to place the wire, the radio inside the command tent shrieked to life one last time. The voice from the ridge was barely a whisper, broken by static and the unmistakable, wet sound of a man struggling to breathe. "Talisman actual. They're on top of us. We're out. Tell my wife." The transmission dissolved into a long, horrifying burst of static, then silence. A dead, final silence. It was a punch to the gut for every soldier standing there. Time was up. We had failed. I saw Sergeant Miller squeeze his eyes shut, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth would crack. The hope that had flickered for a moment was gone, replaced by a cold, sickening certainty of loss. Amara didn't hesitate. She seemed insulated from the wave of despair that washed over us, her focus absolute. She took one small, steadying breath, her small chest rising and falling. Then, with a hand that did not tremble, She reached into the regulator box and firmly pressed the bent piece of wire across the two corroded contact points, bridging the gap. For one long, agonizing second, absolutely nothing happened. No spark, no sound, nothing but the wind. I heard Evans let out a short, sharp sigh, a sound of bitter, vindicated failure. It hadn't worked. It was all for nothing. The collective shoulders of every man on that flight line slumped in defeat. The silence was deafening. It was over. Then, just as the last flicker of hope died, a sound. A deep, mechanical, ohms plants echoed from the guts of the engine, a noise so solid and final it vibrated through the soles of my boots. It was the sound of something immense and ancient shifting, of seized metal being forced to move. Everyone froze. Chief Evans, who had been turning away in disgust, snapped his head back toward the helicopter, his eyes wide with confusion. Amara hadn't moved an inch. She was still leaning into the engine bay, her small hand holding that piece of rusty wire against the contacts with an unwavering calm. It wasn't a child's touch. It was the steady hand of a surgeon who knew exactly where to press to restart a dying heart. She was a statue of pure will, commanding the machine to obey. A split second after the clunk, a brilliant, violent shower of orange sparks erupted from the regulator box where her hand was. They shot out like miniature fireworks, illuminating her grease-stained face in a flash of blinding light and casting long, dancing shadows across the tarmac. A few of the guys flinched back instinctively, shielding their eyes from the sudden glare. I was sure she'd scream, that she'd pull her hand back, burned and shocked by the raw power she'd just unleashed. But she held her ground. She didn't even blink. The sparks rained down around her, a chaotic and beautiful storm of energy. Then came the smell, the sharp, acrid odor of ozone and burning dust, the unmistakable scent of raw electricity tearing through years of neglect. It was the smell of life being shocked back into a dead thing. Before the last spark could even fizzle out, the engine coughed. A single, choked metallic sputter, followed by another, deeper this time. The coughs gave way to a low, hesitant rumble, the sound of a sleeping giant clearing its throat. The entire helicopter frame shuddered, a violent tremor that shook the ground beneath our feet. The rumble caught a rhythm, turning into a deep, powerful chugging that grew louder and louder with every passing second. It was a sound of immense power struggling to be born. Above us, the massive rotor blades began to turn, slowly at first, a lazy womp 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 that sliced through the air. Then they picked up speed, blurring into a steady, powerful hum. Inside the cockpit, Captain Hayes was yelling into his headset, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated disbelief. And then it happened. The chugging exploded into a deafening, triumphant roar. The Mi-17's engine screamed to life, a full-throated, earth-shattering blast of sound that ripped through the valley and completely drowned out the howl of the approaching storm. It was a sound of pure, unrestrained power, a defiant shout against the silence of death that had hung over us moments before. The force of the rotor wash hit us like a physical blow, a hurricane of sand and grit that sent men stumbling backward, throwing their arms up to shield their faces. Loose equipment was sent skittering across the tarmac. The ground vibrated so intensely it felt like the world was shaking. It wasn't just an engine starting, it was a resurrection. A loud, angry, beautiful resurrection that announced to the entire valley that we were not done yet. Through the swirling vortex of dust and debris, I saw him. Chief Warrant Officer Evans, the man of science and schematics, was standing there, completely and utterly frozen. The diagnostic tablet he had been clutching, his personal symbol of modern authority and knowledge, slipped from his numb fingers. It clattered onto the tarmac, the screen shattering into a spiderweb of cracks. He didn't even notice it fall. His mouth was hanging open, his eyes wide with an expression of such profound, absolute shock that it bordered on terror. He was staring at Amara, this tiny, grease-covered refugee girl, as if he were seeing an apparition. All his training, all his manuals, all his arrogant certainty had been rendered meaningless by a piece of trash in the hands of a child. He looked broken. A few feet away from him, Sergeant Miller was in a similar state of paralysis. His hand, the one that had been poised to grab Amara and drag her away, was still hovering in mid-air, frozen in a useless gesture of dismissed authority. He was staring at her, then up at the furiously spinning rotors, then back down at her, his mind visibly struggling to connect the two impossible events. The other soldiers, the ones who had snickered and looked away in embarrassment, were now a silent, awestruck audience. They weren't looking at the helicopter anymore. All eyes, every single pair, were on Amara. She finally pulled her hand back from the engine, clutching the now hot piece of wire. She didn't look triumphant. She simply looked at the roaring machine, gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of satisfaction, and then looked directly at Captain Hayes in the cockpit. The job was done. The roar of the engine was a wall of sound, but in the middle of it there was a strange, focused silence. Captain Hayes didn't waste a second. He gave Amara a quick, sharp nod of his own, a gesture of pure, undiluted gratitude, and his hands flew across the controls. The pitch of the rotors changed, deepening into a powerful thrum as he prepared for immediate takeoff. The entire flight line became a flurry of professional activity, men scrambling to their positions, their earlier despair replaced by a frantic, renewed sense of purpose. But even as they moved, their eyes kept darting back to the small girl standing calmly in the eye of the storm she had created. She had not only started an engine, she had reignited the hope of every single person on that base and given those men on the ridge a fighting chance. The helicopter didn't even wait for the dust to settle. It lifted off with a ferocious urgency, tilting forward and rocketing towards the ridge where we thought 12 men had just died. The sound was deafening, but in the sudden vacuum left by its departure, a new kind of silence fell over us. We were all still standing there, covered in grit, our ears ringing. And every single one of us was staring at Amara. She stood alone in the center of the tarmac, a tiny figure dwarfed by the empty space, still clutching that piece of rusty wire. She wasn't looking at us. She was watching the helicopter, a dark speck climbing against the bruised sky, as if willing it to fly faster. In that moment, she wasn't a refugee or a child anymore. She was the architect of a miracle, and we were the stunned, humbled witnesses. An hour later, which felt like a lifetime, the Mi-17 reappeared over the horizon. It came in low and fast, and as it settled back onto the tarmac, the side door slid open to reveal the faces of the recon team. They were battered, bruised, and exhausted, but they were alive, all 12 of them. They stumbled out, some leaning on their comrades, their faces etched with the grim reality of what they had just escaped. Captain Hayes was the last one out. He walked straight past the medics and the debriefing officers, right up to Amara. He knelt down in front of her, ignoring the crowd, and just said, "Thank you." The men from the ridge, seeing this, understood instantly. One by one, they approached her, their movements slow and full of a reverence that was almost painful to watch. They didn't have words, they just nodded, their eyes saying everything. From that day on, Amara's life on the base was completely different. She was no longer a ghost we shooed away. She became a legend, a piece of our folklore. The guys started calling her the Ghost Ranch, a name spoken with a mixture of awe and affection. She was given this unspoken, unrestricted access to the entire motor pool. No one questioned her presence. Instead of yelling at her to get back, soldiers would greet her with a respectful nod, quietly offering her a cold soda or a chocolate bar from their MREs. It wasn't a formal reward. It was better. It was genuine acceptance. She had earned a place among us not through rank or regulation, but through a quiet, undeniable competence that had put all of our systems to shame. She had become one of us. Sergeant Miller, the man who had been seconds away from dragging her out of the hangar, was a changed man. I never heard him apologize with words. That wasn't his way. But his actions spoke louder than any apology could. A few days after the incident, I saw him driving a Humvee over to the refugee camp, the back loaded with extra pallets of water, blankets, and several large boxes of rations. He didn't make a show of it. He just quietly unloaded the supplies near the tent where Amara lived with her relatives, spoke a few quiet words to the elder, and left. He did this every week until our deployment ended. It was his private penance, his way of making amends for a blindness he was now deeply ashamed of. He made sure the girl who saved his men never went without. But the most profound change was in Chief Warrant Officer Evans. For days he was a ghost himself, avoiding the hangar, his usual arrogant swagger completely gone. Then, about a week later, I saw him approach Amara as she was watching the mechanics work on a broken-down generator. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there for a long moment, watching her. Then, he unzipped a heavy canvas roll he was carrying and laid it on the ground. Inside was his personal set of vintage American wrenches, gleaming chrome vanadium steel, perfectly maintained, the kind of tools a master mechanic collects over a lifetime. It was his prized possession. He picked up the largest wrench, wiped it clean with a cloth, and held it out to her. It was a surrender. A master of the new world, humbly admitting defeat and paying tribute to a master of the old. Amara took the heavy wrench from his hand. She looked at it, then up at him. She didn't smile, but her eyes held a deep, knowing understanding. She gave him a small, simple nod, and he nodded back. That was it. No grand speeches, no formal ceremonies. Just a quiet, powerful exchange between two engineers who understood each other in a language that had nothing to do with words. He left the entire tool roll there for her and walked away, leaving a piece of his pride and his history in her small hands. That day, we all learned a hard lesson. We learned that the most critical knowledge isn't always found in a manual, and that true genius doesn't wear a uniform or care about rank. Sometimes, it comes in the hands of the very people we've forgotten how to see. After that day, I watched Amara differently. She didn't change, not really. She was still the same quiet, observant girl, but she walked with a new kind of gravity. The tools Evans gave her were always with her, rolled up in their canvas pouch. She would spend hours in the motor pool, not just watching, but doing. The other mechanics, humbled by what they had witnessed, started asking for her opinion. "Hey, Ghost Wrench, come listen to this," one would say, pointing to a sputtering engine. She would place her hand on the casing, close her eyes, and then point to a loose belt or a clogged filter. She was never wrong. She was teaching them to listen again, to trust their senses over the cold, sterile data on a screen. She was reminding them that every machine has a story to tell if you only know how to listen. The story of the Mi-17 became a permanent part of the base's history, a tale told to every new rotation of soldiers. It served as a constant reminder of our own fallibility. It changed how we saw the locals, the landscape, and the old, discarded equipment that littered the country. We started seeing value where before we only saw junk. We started to understand that this place, this war, had its own set of rules, its own kind of logic that our advanced technology couldn't always comprehend. Amara didn't just fix a helicopter, she rewired our perspective. She forced a group of highly trained, highly skeptical soldiers to acknowledge that there was a deeper, older wisdom in the world, a wisdom we were in danger of losing completely. That memory has never left me. I can still see her standing there, a small girl against a backdrop of war, holding a piece of scrap wire like it was the key to the entire universe. And in that moment, it was. It reminds me that the biggest walls we face are often the ones we build inside our own minds. Walls of prejudice, of pride, of certainty. Amara tore down that wall with nothing more than her father's knowledge and a courage that shamed every armed man on that base. She proved that one person, no matter how small or overlooked, can change everything. She wasn't just fixing an engine. She was showing us how to see the world, and each other, with new eyes. The legacy of that single afternoon rippled out in ways none of us could have predicted. It wasn't just about respect, it was about survival. Mechanics from other units started seeking her out, bringing their most stubborn problems to the kid mechanic. They learned from her that the old Soviet machines had quirks, personalities that you had to learn through touch and sound. She taught them to look for the simple, mechanical failures before trusting the complex digital readouts. In a very real way, she made our entire fleet more reliable. She saved more than just that one recon team. The knowledge she carried, passed down from her father, ended up saving dozens more lives over the course of that long, brutal deployment, one forgotten wire and one corroded contact at a time. If you know someone who feels underestimated or invisible, someone who needs to be reminded of their own unique strength, please share this story with them. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding your own power, especially when the world tells you that you have none. Thank you for listening. The story of the Mi-17 became a permanent part of the base's history, a tale told to every new rotation of soldiers. It served as a constant reminder of our own fallibility. It changed how we saw the locals, the landscape, and the old, discarded equipment that littered the country. We started seeing value where before we only saw junk. We started to understand that this place, this war, had its own set of rules, its own kind of logic that our advanced technology couldn't always comprehend. Amara didn't just fix a helicopter, she rewired our perspective. She forced a group of highly trained, highly skeptical soldiers to acknowledge that there was a deeper, older wisdom in the world, a wisdom we were in danger of losing completely. That memory has never left me. I can still see her standing there, a small girl against a backdrop of war, holding a piece of scrap wire like it was the key to the entire universe. And in that moment, it was. It reminds me that the biggest walls we face are often the ones we build inside our own minds. Walls of prejudice, of pride, of certainty. Amara tore down that wall with nothing more than her father's knowledge and a courage that shamed every armed man on that base. She proved that one person, no matter how small or overlooked, can change everything. She wasn't just fixing an engine. She was showing us how to see the world and each other with new eyes. The legacy of that single afternoon rippled out in ways none of us could have predicted. It wasn't just about respect. It was about survival. Mechanics from other units started seeking her out, bringing their most stubborn problems to the kid mechanic. They learned from her that the old Soviet machines had quirks, personalities that you had to learn through touch and sound. She taught them to look for the simple, mechanical failures before trusting the complex digital readouts. In a very real way, she made our entire fleet more reliable. She saved more than just that one recon team. The knowledge she carried, passed down from her father, ended up saving dozens more lives over the course of that long, brutal deployment, one forgotten wire and one corroded contact at a time. I often wonder what happened to her. When our tour ended, we left, and she stayed, a young queen in a kingdom of aging machines, armed with a set of American wrenches and a wisdom far beyond her years. I like to think she's out there still, keeping the old engines running, a quiet guardian of a forgotten knowledge. As for Chief Evans, he put in for a transfer a month later. He never regained his old swagger. He wasn't broken exactly, but he was humbled in a way that I don't think he ever recovered from. He'd seen something that his manuals couldn't explain, and it had shaken him to his very core. He learned, as we all did, that true authority doesn't come from rank, but from results. If you know someone who feels underestimated or invisible, someone who needs to be reminded of their own unique strength, please share this story with them. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding your own power, especially when the world tells you that you have none. Thank you for listening.